Welcome to Selling Circular, the podcast dedicated to exploring the innovative minds and business models shaping our transition to a circular economy. My name is Garr, CEO of LoopLayer. Once again, Sabira, not with us today, but will be soon. We're still working through the maternity leave and seeing when she can join us. But I'm joined today by Jamil Wyne, an advisor, investor, educator, and globally connected thinker working at the intersection of climate technology and capital. Jamil is the founder of Climate Tech Bootcamp, a global platform supporting early-stage climate founders. He's the co-founder of the Hazelwood Network and also the lead author of The Climate Tech Opportunity, a major publication out of the Oxford Climate Tech Initiative and Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship. To our knowledge, this is actually the largest study on climate tech done to date, surveying around 140 investors, scientists, policymakers across around 15 countries. He's a Forbes contributor, teaches systems thinking and climate change at George Washington University, and has worked at the World Bank, IFC, USAID, the UN, and multiple other national governments in terms of advising on climate finance strategy. He holds an MBA from INSEAD and a master's from Johns Hopkins SAIS. So, good person to talk to. He knows a little bit about his stuff. And here's the context of what really makes this conversation especially timely. Really, when it comes to climate tech venture funding, we've seen in really a lot of funding come through, basically $100 billion over the past decade. Yet adaptation and resilience is kind of not really talked about in that framework. And so Jamil has actually been focusing on how do we still think about adaptation and resilience so that those two elements of climate tech and our really our reaction to climate change can start to receive some of that capital. McKinsey recently estimated that demand for climate resilience technologies could represent really $1 trillion opportunity for private capital by 2030. Again, this is reactionary. We're thinking of what's going to happen in the future and what capital is going to be necessary and what solutions are going to be necessary to address those changes coming in the future. So really, the political signals, though, in the U.S. have shifted. That's the reality, which creates kind of a bifurcation between what might be clean, mature energy sectors that no longer need government encouragement like they used to, and how do we redirect towards new emerging technologies in areas like decarbonizing building materials or nature-based solutions that we really desperately need, but that may be underfunded or underappreciated. So Jamil recently, sort of in this vein, wanted to put his step forward in releasing a LinkedIn learning course that we'll talk about in our conversation that really helps people understand why climate adaptation and resilience for businesses and government leaders, why that's so important as a part of his broader push to shift the conversation from mitigation only to mitigation and adaptation right now. So we get into the funding landscape, why the VC playbook doesn't always fit climate companies, and why the smartest entrepreneurs and investors are doing things a little bit differently when it comes to capital and climate tech. Here's a conversation with Jamil Wyne. I reached out because you wrote a great piece, and this is the joke of this. In my message to you, I didn't reference the article. I referenced just saying, hey, great piece on Forbes. So I don't remember the article. Do you have any inkling of what article I might have been reaching out about that had something to do with circular economy, something about finance, anything memorable there? Do you remember which one it was?
So it was a while back, but I haven't necessarily hit my stride yet with getting articles to go viral. But the ones that ended up getting, I think, the most kind of clicks there were three, I believe. So one was on climate adaptation, which is what about the business case for climate adaptation. And that's what the LinkedIn course is on. And then another one was on, yeah, exactly. And then one was on ecosystems for climate tech. So that mixture of different institutions and talent and policies, et cetera, that are needed to support climate innovation. And that was also connected to the third piece, which was around investing in climate tech and how there's a tendency sometimes to use a standard venture capital lens to viewing any new company. And it makes sense in a lot of cases, but there's also plenty of exceptions. And we find that often in climate tech because things that are getting built with kind of more of a deep tech approach don't necessarily absorb venture capital in the same way software companies might. But at the same time, um, there's many other forms of capital that we don't talk about enough. And so the article was touching on that. Yeah.
Let's definitely dive into that. I think it is that third one
Okay.
because it's the one
Yeah.
that sometimes I've been most passionate about when thinking about, and this is my only world. I don't know much about a sort of other finance structures in that case. And I think this is a great moment to talk about that. But like, I really feel the pressure of in a past company, in a current company, of what capital really will mean to me. So I think that's definitely what I identified with in that article, which is feeling the the burden of the expectation of scale and what that means for a sustainability company that might feel like the expectations of growth aren't actually maybe sustainable. And somehow there's almost like a sort of a trick there where it's really intimidating when thinking about, okay, I'm trying to build this very conscious company in a very conscious venue with sometimes outsized expectations.
Yeah.
Can you unpack that and sort of what you were seeing and how I might be right or wrong and how I'm feeling about that?
Mhm. No. I think you're right. There's a lot of people that would agree too, Gar. I think that one of the challenges is that we've in some ways become a little bit conditioned to think in terms of venture capital when somebody says that they're an entrepreneur or they're building a startup, particularly around let's say the past 15 to 20 years. There's been such an uptick in VC funding globally, not just within the US. And we really commonly associate startup equals venture capital backable. And in a lot of cases, that's true because if you are, say, in a more software dominant business model, it's a lot, I wouldn't say easy, but relatively easier to prioritize, getting more users. You have maybe a more asset light business model or operating model. And then in doing so, you're not really, I guess VC is still called expensive capital, or sorry, it still is expensive capital. Um, but you can set, at least in theory, more realistic return expectations, and meaning like the amount that you return to your investors and the time period in which you get it back to them. It's a little bit easier for the math to work in your favor.
Because
Not say it's easy or friendly, but it's easier. Yeah.
I see what you're saying, and that's just coming down to scheduling, like all the sort of stages of growth where it's sort of predetermined and outlined if you're hitting those metrics. Is that really what I'm distilling out of that?
Yeah. I mean, any type
You
of
can
funding. Yeah.
tell me no. Tell me where I'm
No, no, no,
so
no,
off
no,
on
no,
this. 'Cause
no.
yeah.
Yeah, it's all good. So really any type of funding, whether it's a grant or a debt instrument or equity, um, it's going to have a return expectation, which is partially a function of the timeline, right? That you need to get it
Yep.
back by, right? So
Yep.
like a mortgage on a house could be like a 30-year repayment period, right? And meaning that you have technically 3 decades. I don't know if you want to wait that long to get all the back. Obviously, you want to pay it off as quickly as possible in a lot of cases. Grants are the same way, right? Not necessarily in terms of repayment, but in terms of maybe performing certain tasks and hitting certain milestones. And obviously, if it's a repayable grant, then you are more on the clock. And venture capital is seen as one of the more kind of ambitious, aggressive forms of funding because it takes a chunk of ownership, but also usually you have maybe a 10-year period or so to get it back, and that means you have to start not only making money because a lot of times companies that take on VC funding are not necessarily profitable yet. So you not only have to make money, but you also have to become profitable or at least generate enough revenue to give them an interesting return. And interesting
Right.
usually means something like a 10x plus return. And it's really hard, right? I mean, most companies can't make that. Not because they're not good companies, not because they're not good teams. It's just because it's a very lofty goal. And the expectations around VC, I think have gone up a lot where, 15, 20 years ago, the concept of a unicorn was still relatively nascent. Now it's seen as a given that all VCs want to see a couple unicorns in their portfolios, and that's not doable most of the time. And so you've used the word expectation a few times, and I think it's 100% right that it's hard to generate that type of return over that type of period for anybody, even in a software business. And with climate tech, which I think would include circular economy here too, you're not necessarily uh, it's not devoid of software by any means. There's certainly plenty of room for software in it, but it's oftentimes hard assets like building materials, energy systems, charging batteries, et cetera. Sorry, charging systems and batteries, just to name a few, that take many years in a lab, that take a lot of time to pilot, take a lot of time to sell, and it's harder to generate a return in that same time period. That would make VC the only type of capital that's relevant.
Yeah, I think that's where, I mean, so much of what we find in some of the most successful seemingly businesses that we've interviewed here on Selling Circular that are fitting both within the niche. Like there's this interesting Venn diagram of like very investable and circular economy business. And it fits, there's that overlap tends to be around businesses that the raw thought here of like can fit in line with investable expectations. Like they're almost
Mhm.
disrupting a status quo industry. And so therefore the path to profitability or at least revenue generation is like well understood, as opposed to maybe the more out there disruptive businesses, which I'm not saying are better or worse, but then the path is more unknown and so therefore a greater risk. But some of those ones that I just love pointing these businesses out because they take, and actually we have one this season which is so interesting and I'd love your take on it. It was an episode done the last couple weeks of, it's a porta potty business. So
Mhm. Interesting.
it's a porta potty business that is now taking the urine and extracting the phosphorus and creating a fertilizer business out of it.
Amazing.
So it's like
Yep.
it's fitting in line with being like, oh, this is an investable business because now they sell porta potties. They just happen to not dump the urine at a waste treatment plant. They harvest the urine and then create a new revenue model out of it. It's like,
Mhm.
okay, that's an interesting Venn diagram. And so, do you see those types of things in the climate tech space? I mean, how is that fitting with how you understand investable and sustainability, climate tech, or circular economy businesses?
Yeah, I think that what happened at one point, and it I think became a bit of a double-edged sword, was climate tech became really closely associated with the general kind of global imperative of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by corporations and governments primarily. Um, and in a lot of ways, that was a great forcing function. But what we realized is that not all technologies that fall under kind of the decarbonization goals of that, which does not include necessarily the adaptation and resilience goals, they have varying levels of maturity and market readiness. They are not all going to the same buyer at the end of the day. Those buyers oftentimes have varying timelines to actually making a deal happen. And so we tried, I think, to paint with broad strokes and say climate tech is an asset class. Climate tech is going to behave in a certain way because there's a downward kind of policy pressure. That's true in some cases. But if a technology is not mature, it's not mature. If it doesn't have a buyer yet, it doesn't have a buyer yet. And it doesn't mean that it won't. Right. It just means that it's
Yeah,
maybe not ready. And so in the case you're providing, my say would like, look, if there's enough willing buyers and that market size is big and the costs of accessing that market are not so prohibitive that you're going to have to be pumping cash into it for a prolonged period just for them to break even, then why would not an investor be interested, right?
right,
And so
right.
the math still needs to pencil out in a way that makes it look like this is a big market that is accessible and is ready to buy. And that sales cycle is short enough that you're not waiting for, I mean, and unfortunately, this is the case for a lot of companies in this space, a year plus to figure out if someone is going to buy from you. Right.
Yeah,
And that's hard, right? It's really
that's
hard. My
really,
heart
yeah.
goes out to people that are figuring out how to do that. I don't know if I'd have the stomach for it. Right. And so the smart investors and the smart entrepreneurs are the ones that are going to know how to navigate those pathways the best. And that's something I think a lot of folks are still learning.
Yeah, especially in this climate sustainability tech era that because it's so interesting, right? Because the need is there. That path to procurement is developing. Like, I mean, that it's really becoming clearer and clearer. That policy pressure shifting, which we can talk about. I mean, it seems to be ebbing and flowing. I would love, though, an example, if we took a step back real quick, that you probably had in mind that tech that matured. In my head, I went to solar panels, where it was just like all of a sudden everything was in line, where it was like, okay, policy's here, tech is here. Let's light the runway with money so that just everything can go to funding mechanisms and selling solar panels. Is that really what we're talking about here in terms of like the systems aligning for that type of mass success?
Yeah, I think you're right there. So I led a study a couple of years ago at Oxford that we called the Climate Tech Opportunity, and we surveyed 140-ish investors and scientists and policymakers and similar experts in the climate tech space. Climate/climate tech space.
Yeah.
And then we interviewed maybe like 50 to 60 separately, some of which from that sample, others were not. And so we ended up with this really interesting data set from maybe, I would say about 15 different countries, is where we compiled the sample from. And we asked them about, where do you see the most promising opportunity in the energy space and the mobility space and the built environment and nature-based solutions, et cetera. And when it comes to things like, as you said, energy and, specifically solar, the promising opportunities were really around like building efficiency in the sector, right? And so then that you're dealing with a more mature sector because you're thinking about, how do we make it more efficient now, right? It's like, we've built, as you said, the system. We understand how it works. We know where the buyers are. We know how to incentivize them to buy. Or we're not even worried about incentivizing them any longer because the market has taken care of
The
that.
market, right?
Exactly. But then if you look at something like a built environment, where we're thinking about decarbonized steel, decarbonized concrete, there's a lot of circular economy plays in the built environment as well. The responses that we got were less around, let's build efficiency, and more so, let's get things into the market first. And it doesn't mean that, to your point, like there's abundant need, right? So that's not false at all. But we were starting, or they were starting at a point that was a little bit, I would say, more nascent, because a lot of the technologies were by no means stuck in a lab still, but they had yet to emerge in a point where we could say that they could outperform the incumbent at scale. And with energy, it's easier to make that case. With EV, it's easier to make that case because we have so many examples of things that we just take for granted now, because solar's been around for long enough. Tesla's been around for long enough. We have many offshoots of these different brands and technologies that we can point to easily. With others, it's harder. And so it doesn't mean that they're not investable, that they're not important. It just means that we have to have a more patient approach when it comes to getting them into the market.
I'm thinking of this company that I don't want to name to put any bad light on it. I love this company. I love this concept. It was combining AI with robotics to actually, you know what? I'll say this because I can. It's the company's called Urban Machine. I think Urban Machine's brilliant. I will then say that very publicly. I've had them on the podcast. I think it is clear that the buying signals for their concept were not totally there, and so they've had a slowdown. I don't want that to be seen as negative if anybody's listening to this in the audience, but they were, again, combining AI and robotics. But what was really clear to me, and I think it's what you were saying, the procurement path wasn't totally laid out. So they had this amazing solution that would denail wood to be able to be reused faster than a human could denail wood, so that the wood, so that it could be taken out and it could be easily deconstructed, denailed, and then essentially resupplied and verified for reuse. But there was no, like, who's going to buy it? What are they going to pay for it? It's like, it was almost a business model. It wasn't a technology problem. They've got the technology. It was a business model where even they have a great business model, but the buyer wasn't willing to pay that price yet for that thing. And so it's a fascinating problem where it's almost like they'll be a super popular company in 10 years when like somehow the market's caught up and the lumber now is priced higher. And so is that sort of again in that vein of like this perfect storm where they had the right too. They had the people, the tech, the model, but then the buying opportunity wasn't there. And it wasn't working. I mean, how do you see that sort of playing out at large with climate tech or with sustainability, where ultimately we had a lot of momentum going into 2017,
Right.
18, 19, 20, and then it's slowed. There's
Yeah.
probably been the slow. I'm speaking anecdotally, but I'm curious if you have even any empirical knowledge of a slowing.
Yeah, I think it varies a little bit. So I think some of the slowing comes when the political, no pun intended, like climate around climate tech
Yeah,
changes,
totally.
right?
Yeah,
Government is, even if government isn't necessarily incentivizing the purchase of the particular product you talked about there,
yeah,
they send the most powerful message across the country when they prioritize decarbonization, adaptation and resilience, et cetera. And just by virtue of putting it on, the White House website and incorporating into speeches, et cetera, it it sends a signal to private investors that
wow,
no other source, no other voice or authority can. And so we definitely have, I think, put a lot of that on pause. Now, what's I think then happened, there's been a bit of a bifurcation where some of these technologies, your solar energy, your EVs, your charging, et cetera, have a strong enough business case around them already that we don't really need to worry as much about encouraging their adoption in theory, because people can still say, well, look, it just makes sense, right? I can sell back to the grid. I have access to a charger and I can save money on gas, right? Like these little
yeah,
things that make it more appealing to purchase, I think are I don't want to say they're set in stone, but they're much more secure in our kind of daily lives and spending habits. When it comes to things like decarbonizing building materials, um, I would say nature-based solutions, these types of things, there's very strong coalitions of the willing that are backing
mm,
them, meaning, talent, research, a small group of funders that believes in them. Sometimes it's corporate funding, sometimes it's private or family office funding. So it's not so much that the well is dry, but the fervor surrounding them isn't what it once was. And I think
yeah,
that means that, as I said earlier, and when we did this study, we saw that a lot of these more nascent verticals were not so much, they weren't nascent because they weren't necessary. It was just because we, for whatever reason, from an innovation angle, hadn't gotten it to a point where we could get costs down enough and also performance, vis-a-vis the incumbent, well enough that
yeah.
average buyers or businesses that would be buying these materials would say this is a good idea. Now that's the U.S. context. I think that the EU, for instance, other nations, Japan, Australia, et cetera, have done, from what I can tell, a very good job of creating more downward policy pressure. And also it's showing up in parts of the world that we don't necessarily associate sometimes with really progressive climate policy. UAE has recently passed a fairly
Interesting.
aggressive decarbonization policy. I think when it comes to adaptation and resilience, China has passed a lot of very important policies, around, and also a lot of infrastructure spending around flood protection. India is seen as very, very forward thinking when it comes to protecting against extreme heat. So these are all
India's been
examples of
so impressive.
governments. Yeah,
We've been
exactly.
seeing,
India's case
yeah,
study after case study on dealing with extreme heat because they have to, right? And I think,
yeah,
I think,
and trash in terms of like EPR stuff, environmental
okay, so
responsibility
you
stuff.
would know
Yeah,
that better than me. Yeah, but
yeah,
that makes
yeah.
good sense. And I think in each one of those cases, Mother Nature forces our hand, right?
Mm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think in the US, we haven't
We're not
had our
feeling
hand
it.
forced as much. It's
Yep.
happening, right? We have our forest fires, we have our flooding, we have our unpredictable weather patterns that create anxiety, and we do have climate migration, we have water scarcity. So we're not devoid of it. I just don't think it's overtaken our lives enough yet. Not to say that I hope it never does, but it looks like it will at some point. And
Yeah.
that's when I think the spending, we don't have much of a choice but to step up then. And I don't know what that's going to look like. It could look like a lot of emergency humanitarian assistance, right? And that's its own cost. So
Yeah.
I suspect that will be happening. And a point of the LinkedIn course was that we have a window that we can start preparing for now, but it's hard to pull that off. Yeah.
Well, to get to that, I'd love for you to talk a little bit about the course. I also think, and why I wanted to chat on the podcast too, is I love people that find themselves in positions for feedback loops. And so I'd be curious when it comes to either the course and then the writings and you being sort of publicly talking about this either in written form or in presentation form, and then also in course form, where what you're feeling in terms of what's coming back at you. And
Right.
and so I'd love any sort of sense of that, but let's talk about the course and then we can jump into sort of that feedback nature of that.
No, yeah, no, I appreciate those questions, Gar, because it's something that I'm still sifting through. But the course was, I loved putting it together. Shout
Yeah.
out to an amazing LinkedIn Learning team. I got to work pretty closely with them for about 4 to 5 months, and that was everything from building out the general concept to creating the table of contents
Yeah.
to scripting each chapter in the course, to rehearsing it and making sure that not only were there clear takeaways, but also I was speaking clearly enough, right? Like they were
Yeah.
phenomenal. They held my hand from stage, step zero all the way to the finish line. And so I just had a really good time doing it, and I hope to do it again.
And can you fill in real quickly too what it was
Mhm.
about for the audience?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Important
Great.
detail,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it focused on climate adaptation and resilience for business and government leaders. And reason why I did that was a few things. So to put a little bit of a definition around it, and this is, in the course as well, but broadly, you can break climate solutions into one of two camps: mitigation or adaptation. And there's also some overlap. Mitigation always is going to be reducing and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So your go-to usual suspects of energy, mobility, built environment, et cetera. Agriculture too often has a lot of mitigation within it, given the emissions that come from ag. But at the same time, you have the realities of a warming planet, where as temperatures go up, and average temperatures go up, of course, that it just becomes harder to operate, whether you are thinking about organic and kind of human and plant life operating, infrastructure and supply chain operating. It becomes more difficult in ways that we haven't necessarily, as a global population, really started to comprehend, I think. Extreme heat is often the case people use, right, to say
Can I
it. Yeah, of course. Yeah, go ahead.
can I give an example here just for the audience
Yeah,
of
yeah, of
I
course.
feel like I'm feeling it. My partner and I, she happens to be the HOA president for our 13-person condo association. So
Okay.
we had to redo our insurance policy for the building.
Mm,
And prices are going up. And the reason, as we were sort of trying to discover, why are prices going up? And they're like, Illinois, where we live, has gotten an abnormal, or maybe the new normal, amount of storm related and tornado related events. And so prices as a state are going up. But as
yeah,
you're talking about, I can't help but think, oh, that's the operating cost. That's the operating infrastructure cost that is going up. And that's the pressure that we will be feeling. And it's going to start monetarily and then get incrementally into, oh, I'm just kind of more uncomfortable than I used to be. Like I'm just,
absolutely.
and so that's what I was hearing when you're sort of going through those. And so that's how that was really sticking with me in a very visceral moment right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Gar. I think insurance is one of the better examples of how it's changing in real time. Like, it's not theoretical any longer. A lot of when we talk about adaptation and resilience is in that realm of things that are happening in the present moment. A lot of mitigation technologies, I think people would argue, are servicing our near-term needs and
Mm-hmm.
helping to minimize long-term threats. adaptation is similar in the sense that it's built for the near term, but it's about addressing an immediate risk. And insurance is a great example of seeing a traditional industry kind of retreat a bit or have to rethink its model. So yeah, you're right. And we talked about insurance in the course. The way that I think about it sometimes is through the lens of extreme heat, where a lot of us don't realize it, and myself included, but it doesn't really take a big change in temperature for it to become not only uncomfortable to be outside, but dangerous to be outside. And you don't have to increase by all that much especially if you're dealing with outside labor, for labor productivity to go down considerably. So a several degrees Fahrenheit increase, and I don't know the numbers definitively, but let's say if you move from if your average temperature in the summer is in the 90s, you're already pushing it. But if you say you cross into 95, 100 territory, not only do you work few hours, you work about half as many hours, right? And don't quote me on the temperature change, but the reduction in productivity, I think, is pretty accurate. And it becomes dangerous too.
Yes, everyone listening's like, yeah, I'm going to want a little bit more of that shade. So I'm going to go walk over there real quickly, get a break, get a drink of water, then get back to it. Not a hard thing to be thinking through on productivity going down.
And if you think about it, I started working in the Middle East, and that's obviously a hot region. I lived there for about 7 years, and it's heating up about twice as fast as the rest of the world. And they at the same time are
effect.
Exactly. And they're industrializing very quickly too. And so I had a conversation with a country that was hosting a very large sporting event, and they were asking about how are we going to adjust to extreme heat. And on one hand, because you and I work in the tech space and we work with entrepreneurs, we think, okay, so what are those different gadgets? And you see a suite of extreme heat tech solutions that are emerging, right? Hardware solutions, different types of cooling shirts and mentions like innovative shade technologies, et cetera. But at the same time, a lot of this is about training people how to deal with the fact that they will probably be around somebody who faints due to extreme heat. And what do you do in that case, right? How do you take care of that person? Having, as you said, people are going to go out, have to drink a lot more water. We have to be proactively setting up more kind of water and cooling stations, right? If you go to Saudi Arabia and you see Mecca, you see these very innovative shades that kind of come down at certain times of the day. Huge, beautiful kind of works of art type shades, right? Not just like a cover. And so countries and I think, India is a great example of it too, where it's one of the hottest countries in the world. It's obviously one of the most populous countries of the world, has a lot of low income housing and a lot of low income populations, people that are very, very vulnerable. And so you immediately move into healthcare territory, right? You move into labor productivity territory. And it's one thing if you have a hot day or two out of the year. It's another if that just becomes your reality. And I think we're finding that adaptation and resilience, adaptation being defined as a process of adapting, because you never fully are done adapting. Resilience being like a quality, right? Your ability or a quality to be resilient. We have to build those muscles very, very fast, right? And some of that's going to be tech. Some of that's also just going to be smarter usage of the infrastructure and resources we already have. McKinsey did a great study on it recently that talked about the potential savings from adaptation and resilience, and how a lot of the solutions around it aren't necessarily going to be the shiny objects. They're just going to be the smart objects. And so it's something that we also talked a lot about in the course, which was a lot of fun to cover.
Yes, the best solutions are probably going to be the ones that are the most boring. It's like somehow in there that when it comes to then the feedback loops, you're kind of probably splitting two audiences. I'm guessing you're kind of going for maybe an executive audience that's trying to think through adaptation and resilience types of measures, either internal to a company or for a population, and then the lay person who's also, or maybe not lay, but just someone who's really interested in this topic and trying to upskill or re-educate themselves into what this means for their life or their career or they're just trying to be ready. How are you getting these feedback mechanisms? I mean, what are you getting back from those two audiences that are sort of receiving these messages in different ways?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we're still figuring it out, to be honest,
Cool.
Who is most interested. I think you're right that there's a way of divvying up the audience into those categories. The ones that are I wanted to get educated. It was a bit garbled. I want to get better educated on climate change. Let me hop on LinkedIn Learning and see what they're offering. Right.
Right. Yep.
That's an audience that we're obviously want to be useful for. The other audience is that group of ideally executives in both public and private sectors that are saying, look, it's in my interest to get educated on this because I think it has real world applications on my business. The
Yep.
challenge I think the first challenge we were trying to solve for was that, kind of the level of public discourse around something is often kind of directly correlated with the amount of funding it receives, right? Like a lot of funding is going into AI. We're talking about AI all the time, right? Um, Not a lot of funding goes into adaptation. We're not talking a lot about adaptation. And so the first goal of the course was, let's just shine a light on this issue, because for years we either avoided talking about it or we felt a little shy about it because it was seen a little bit as giving up, right? By you
Right.
saying it's going to get too hot, let's get ready for it, you're also saying all of our efforts, the billions of dollars going into renewable energy, battery storage, et cetera, they are extremely useful. We are not doing it enough. We need more of it, but it is not going to be, we are not going to be ready in time, basically. Right.
Societally,
And
we're not that good at nuance. I think historically, we
it's
just
hard.
cannot
It's a
seem to,
nuance. Yeah.
yeah, we cannot seem to balance two things being right at the same time. Yeah.
It's really tough, right? Because
Yeah.
you say you define one vis-a-vis the other, and by
Right.
default,
Yes.
you kind of put them in competition. And it's not either or, it's both. And at the same time, to go back to what we were saying earlier about technologies that can generate returns now, the energy is and mobility make a really strong case, right? They're something that investors are very familiar with. We don't really scratch our heads and say, how do you make money off of renewable energy, or why would anybody buy an EV? The case is clear. What's tough with adaptation and resilience often is it gets positioned as a public good,
Mm.
or or a good that we're not actively purchasing and monetizing in a steady, recurring way. It's not always the case, of course. There's plenty of exceptions, but water is very cheap, right? Food is relatively affordable. These are, in my mind, kind of at the core of adaptation and resilience. Weather predictions are essentially free. We don't have to pay. We pay for the internet, and we get everything that comes on the internet with it, including Weather Channel and data on temperatures and whatnot. And so it's very difficult, I still think, to convince people to invest. And that's why the case around adaptation is usually one of loss avoidance rather than generating a
Mm.
return. You can still profit off of that because you're avoiding losses, and
I
losses are a key component in calculating profit. So
I love the idea that insurance companies
yeah,
are going to be the ones adopting resilience and adaptation measures and
we
trying to
hope
put those
so.
things in. We hope so, right? That would be the
Yeah.
best case scenarios. They're like, oh, this is such a money saver for us. We need to make sure whole cities are ready for this.
Yeah. And now the challenge, and this is where I think the fears emerge, is some groups will just pull out entirely, right? They'll just, for instance, you can think about it from the lens of companies who do business in emerging markets, or they don't do emerging
Mm.
market business, meaning emerging market typically is associated with lower incomes, higher unemployment levels, less purchasing power. And I think a lot of companies don't sell in these markets because of those reasons, right? They say, look, is there a point in setting up in country X where I can't necessarily guarantee a profit in a certain amount of time? Why don't I just stay in the 10 countries that have enough purchasing power for me to sustain my operations and grow them? And I think sometimes for the longest time, and this was in my old world of economic development, we tried really hard to make a case that there is a strong business case for investing in emerging markets, and I still think there is, but it's still a work in progress convincing people to do that, convincing businesses to do that, convincing investors to put their money there. And I think it's an analogous to what we're going to find with adaptation and resilience, where we're going to say, we don't disagree that this is necessary. And we also don't disagree that these are risks that we're facing. However, it may be a lot easier for us to just avoid doing business in this geography entirely now. And I think that's a risk, and that we're already seeing play out. Insurance companies are a little bit of the canary in the coal mine, where they're like, I could develop this really innovative insurance product to make sure that we can stay active in Florida, or I could just pull out, right? And I know it's more complicated than just that, but I think in hindsight, it'll look like they had to make a call of, do I invest money in getting innovative, or do I just cut my losses now before things get worse? And some will choose A, some will choose B, and remains to be seen how many will choose each. But it's not going to be, I think, as easy, unfortunately, as we all made the smart choice to get innovative and prepare.
Right.
A lot of us will just say, it's similar to climate migration. It's another analogy, right? It's like, I could stay and tough it out. I could just also leave. And that's going to be a way that a lot of people adapt to climate change, is just leaving. And it's sad to say out loud, but it's real and it's already happening.
Yeah. On that, then, on the more probably, on the wider cast of writing about some of these topics, what does that feedback mechanism look like for you personally? I mean, I think just having a pod, I'm able to get I have this sort of beacon where people come to me and they're like, wow, this is crazy. I mean, this is a topic that I haven't thought about. Or do you have any sort of that? What does that look like, both on either adaptation or sort of adoption, or climate and resilience there,
Mhm.
or even on the other finance related things that you do discuss? I mean, what are you hearing? What are you sort of projecting out in the world and saying, hey, this is what I'm thinking about, and what are you getting back in response?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I think I kind of dodged unintentionally the question when it came
No,
to
no,
the
no.
feedback on
Yeah,
the course. So I want to do
yeah,
that. I'll circle back now and do that, and then I'll connect it back to the articles. So feedback on the course, it's so far, I have enough of a following on LinkedIn that I can
yeah.
send it around to close friends and colleagues, and they'll take a look at like a video or two and provide some thoughts. And I think what a lot of people are saying is that it's needed because we're just not talking about this issue enough, and so
Right.
there's a certain percentage of the audience, so to speak, that just says this is refreshing. I'm glad somebody did this,
I'm
and
glad there's a
that
spotlight on this that actually is
exactly.
like putting some attention toward it. Yeah, right.
Exactly. And what we will eventually need is, courses on LinkedIn, Coursera, Udemy, in university classes, et cetera, that are talking about this. It's just, I think we're still in the early days. So on one hand, some people are just responding about that. Others are saying, look, like, we don't understand this issue and we need to change that. And so that's also
Mm.
been refreshing in its own way, where somebody in a corporation or somebody in a government is takes a look at it. And what I would obviously want to be able to do is work with them to help think through some of these challenges that we cover in the videos. But at a minimum, I want them to look at it and say, I can start to broaden my horizons a little bit. And you're almost asking them to move from being uh, a responsible environmental steward to a smarter business leader. Because what I tried to do in the course is stay away from any type of discussion of the right thing to do, and more say this
Mm.
is just the smart thing to do because it will affect your business. And when it comes to the articles, I think that it's still a little bit of a work in progress to figure out how people are responding. I think what most people are really interested in, though, um, you know, is the funding story. What are the different types of capital that are really going to be needed? If we were to look at the climate unicorns of today, is, companies IPO and get purchased and stand the test of time. When we look back at their cap tables, or look at not just the owners from an investment angle, but the capital providers, who provided debt and grants, we'll probably see a humongous list of different types of capital, right? We're going to see various research grants, long lists of angel investors, many, many different types of seed investors, project finance, debt providers, et cetera. And so they will in some ways be examples of modern day financial industry, right? Because they'll have a little bit of everything that's backed them in some shape or form to get them where they are. And so people respond well to that, because it's important to be, I think, just there's a lot of people that say it already. Like, very little that I write about hasn't been said before by somebody else or multiple someones. But I just get to say it on Forbes, which has a bit broader reach, I think. And I think also people respond well to the adaptation story because
Yep.
people are waking up to it. We are all in some shape or form able to tell a growing number of climate related stories in our lives, right? You just told one about how you and your partner are watching in real time insurance premiums go up. We're all developing those different, our own little bespoke books of
Yep.
climate risks in our daily lives. And I think as that happens, more of us are saying, I understand what adaptation is. And again, I'm kind of preaching to the choir when I write this stuff because other people have said it, but I think those are the ones that get good response. The last one that gets good response and the feedback that I get on it is around AI, because as you mentioned earlier, nuance is difficult, right? For me too. I like things being black and white. Ambiguity sometimes makes me anxious. And so I want to know when it comes to AI and climate, like what's the definitive story? And that story is just starting to get told, right? Like we're just
Yep.
starting to realize like, well, we know that AI is a water guzzler and a big emitter, et cetera. We have yet to really figure out what building resilience, building our adaptation capabilities via AI looks like. Um, People say that AI could solve climate change. I don't think we even know what that really means yet. I think we're a ways away from figuring out how lofty of a goal we should be setting for it, but we're
Yeah.
also a ways away from understanding that it's not a binary and it's also not a finished story. And so I think there's still room if we want to take more control over the narrative. And it's hard when it's moving so fast, but there's a window still.
It was one of the concerns I had. I was giving a presentation at Green Biz, a conference in Scottsdale, and there was probably about 100 people in the audience, and was giving a presentation around how do you build AI, or how do you build sustainability products with AI. And part of the need that I was trying to service in that was uh, the understanding that sustainability professionals, circular economy professionals live in a very specific niche, and that you might be able to build a product to service that niche that otherwise might be underserved, not either actually delivered at all in terms of a product, or too expensive for your team to purchase. And so you might actually be able to build something. And when you're talking about impact on AI, it was really interesting that I thought it was going to be much more necessary to give a disclaimer of the impact before my presentation. So I put up a little video. We talked about energy. We talked about water, and the audience could not have cared less. They were like, we're not concerned with this. And the answer, like, I could kind of tell, like, you can kind of feel the vibe in a room when you're presenting something, you're talking about it. It's like, oh, this isn't taking. And I didn't kind of understand why. Might be because we were a little oversaturated on talking about impact, maybe.
Right.
But I actually got the answer a little bit later, which is I had two folks. I had one that was in the property management business and another person that was in the manufacturing business. And both of them were very candid in how gung-ho their organizations were about using AI, but how infinitesimally small AI's energy input was for their business. And in the property management case, he said it's less than half of 1% of 1%. Like, it was some tiny fraction of their energy costs, because they're a property management company, and most of their energy's in water, or most of their energy, well, a lot of water, but then also lighting and HVAC. And that was so dominant of an energy that they just weren't that concerned about it. But it was fascinating to me that it just wasn't really on their radar in the same way in which it's so a part of mine as a residential consumer that spends a lot of time with AI. It's probably
Yeah.
outsized my impact by a lot. And so
Yeah.
it was that really interesting perspective on scale when it comes to AI, and how everyone was very forthcoming, being like, we're not that concerned because our energy impact is already enormous.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that there's a crowd that would also say, and I sometimes, to be frank, find myself a little bit a part of that crowd where I'm like, well, we were gonna pass, or we've already passed, or we're about to pass 1.5 anyway, and everybody needs to get ready for a 2 degree, if not a 3 degree centigrade. I think some countries are preparing for like a 3 or 4.
Oh my
So
gosh.
it doesn't mean that therefore we need to just, unleash all AI, kind of AI's full, kind of full power and potential and crank emissions up to 11. But I also think we run a risk sometimes of positioning it as, if we didn't use it, we would still stay within, how do you say it, striking distance or whatever of like the 1.5 threshold. And I think others would say, well, look, like we're gonna pass that anyway. And so it's a very nuanced conversation.
It's
It's a difficult one to have. I also think we're still in the early days of the two, and I think sometimes part of the nuance around it is that climate and AI have a lot of similar qualities in my mind, right? They're these human created forces that are far stronger than any government, business, etc. We don't, I don't think, have enough control over them to stop them. They're
mm,
out there. They're going to happen anyway. Yet we often talk about them still in terms of a binary and say, who is going to, solve climate change? And in my mind, climate and AI are more akin to systems and than anything. And systems aren't, they're not defeated. They're not,
they're not
um,
on and off switches.
exactly. You can't shut them off. You can just find ways to navigate them. And I think that's our task now, is to figure out how do we navigate them individually, but also leverage AI in particular to navigate climate, which unfortunately does come at a cost of increasing emissions and reducing our access to or resources as well. And so I don't have answers for some of that, but that's how I kind of current frame of mind is.
I love that take. I think it's a good reframe for me that I can speak cavalierly about it, and then also need to consistently, and I think this is probably the problem in general, is how do we hold so many of these levers in our mental model of like, okay, we're considering this, we're factoring in this, we're factoring this, and immediately even when I was talking about it, I lost perspective in a 1.5 to 4.4 degrees Celsius sort of framework. And it's like, okay, yeah, that's kind of the most important thing, is we do need to stay in striking distance. And how do we stay in striking distance? And is this increasing our chance of not hitting those metrics there? Um, when it comes to, then I would love your take then on, like, when it comes to what sort of gives you hope in this, like, as we really round this out, of like, where are you seeing that path toward more adoption, more adaptation, more
Mhm.
resilience, and how that's sort of all trending, and how we can sort of take away what we can take away from this.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that my definition of hope has had to evolve a fair bit, because I think there was a time where, just like a lot of people, I would say, well, our hope is, and kind of our hope relies on our ability to stay below 1.5, and as long as we do that, we can stay hopeful. I am now in that camp that says, and then I went to the camp that says, we're going to cross it. And, and as a result, I don't know what to be hopeful for any longer. I think I've evolved to the point where I think the hope is going to come not so much in the form of technology saving us, or, um, us finding ways to plug all the investment gaps that we're facing. I think it's going to come in the form of human beings figuring out how to coexist with each other and navigate this increasingly difficult world, in the sense that I think we will surprise ourselves in a lot of ways. Not surprise ourselves necessarily in terms of coming up with a gadget or a tool that quote unquote saves us. More so, it will test our resilience and demonstrate ways that we can coexist in ways that we probably didn't think so. And it's not the best example, but it's one that's been on my mind a lot. There was a book that came out a couple years ago called Humankind by Rutger Bregman, which was about how there's this tendency to feed us with very negative news and, algorithms on various news sites and social media, understand that human beings click more when there's a negative or a sad or kind of scary story. And because of that, we start seeing humanity through that lens. And what the author argues is that, yes, there are plenty of cases and plenty of stories still, and there will be for many years for the foreseeable future, where we are going to be afraid of current events and kind of fearful of one another. But there's also plenty of stories out there, both from history in the current era and hopefully in the future era too, where humans find ways not just to be resilient and survive, but to take care of one another. And so he uses examples like in the bombing of London in World War II, there was this prediction that the not only would the Germans bomb and destroy a lot of infrastructure, but it would basically obliterate London and force the population to leave. So they had kind of started evacuating early. And what happened was it built, at least in the author's mind, a much more resilient community. People stayed, people still went to school, people still led their daily lives as best as they could. And what was interesting was that they realized that the bombing didn't necessarily have the intended impact. And then the Brits repeated that mistake on the Germans by bombing them, and the same thing happened where they became more resilient. And he argues that it actually prolonged the war, which is kind of ironic, right? Because you would think it would do the opposite. And so who would have predicted that attacking a capital city like London or Berlin led to building more resilient communities? And I'm not saying that's the solution here, but I'm just saying he uses those as examples to, excuse me, to demonstrate that when humans are pushed into a corner and tested, we will surprise ourselves. And he uses many examples throughout history like that. I don't think those in and of themselves are worth banking on as saving graces of humanity and the planet, but
Right.
I think that they are enough proof that there are things that we can't predict that could actually really give us hope. And so that's where hope for me comes from right now. Not so much that there is going to be a breakthrough innovation. I know there will be. There already are. That's going to happen. I don't worry about that any longer. I think but my money is going to be now more on how do humans figure out how to manage living in this world with each other.
I find that enormously hopeful that we are in this by both the nature of being Homo sapien and the fact that we will figure this out as Homo sapiens in community with one another, that we can figure this out.
It's been happening already, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You look around, you look at the Middle East, it's a very hot, desertified piece of the planet, and it's home to over 300 million people. India, very hot in many places, home to over 1 billion. China also has, some very unforgiving terrain, people, and over 1 billion people, right? Those are just a couple examples. Large swaths of Africa, most populous, will be one of the most populous, if not the most populous, continent in the not too distant future, or already is. And people are figuring out how to survive. And I'm not saying that it's easy. I'm not saying that it's replicable. It doesn't work for everybody, but I think we need to spend a lot more time studying parts of the world that are finding themselves in a much more difficult situation with climate change than ourselves right now, to get a glimpse into what the future is going to look like. That helps inform what we need to do to address risks, but it also can, I think, give us a little bit of hope that others are already on their way to figuring this out. And it may not be in the form of some breakthrough innovation. It might be in the form of us having certain behavioral changes and ways that we build and maintain community that can't necessarily be solved with tech, but can be solved by humans.
Jamil, thank you for joining us today. If anybody wants to reach out, how do they interact with you, either on LinkedIn, check out the course on LinkedIn, or through Hazelwood Network? How do they find you?
Yeah, LinkedIn is the best. I find myself spending a lot more time on it these days for obvious
Yeah.
reasons. And so I love getting messages from people, especially if they took the course or read an article or just want to chat. And so anybody that's listening, please feel free to reach out and really appreciate this, Gar. I'm glad we got a chance to do it. And it was a great conversation. Thank you.